You're listening to Word on the Reef, diving into marine science on the Great Barrier Reef and beyond, with Tanya Murphy and Brett Goodban. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Word on the Reef. I'm your host, diver and marine conservationist Tanya Murphy. And with me, as always, is Cairns Aquarium's marine educator and fish whisperer, Brett Goodban.
Good morning, everyone. We're back.
Now, Brett, today We're playing Guess Who.
Oh, good. I like this.
So you need to guess who I am, okay?
All right.
According to folklore, I'm the animal that inspired sailors' stories about mermaids.
Mm-hmm.
But I can grow up to 4 metres or 13 feet long. I can weigh over a tonne, and I have whiskers.
Well, it sounds a bit like my cat, but I'm going to go with the dugong or sea cow.
It's a big hairy mermaid.
Yeah.
I can hold my breath for longer than 6 minutes and dive to a depth of 40 metres. But I spend most of my life in shallow waters eating my favourite food, seagrass.
They love their seagrass, don't they?
I can eat up to 30 kilograms of it in a day.
30 kilos.
I communicate with my friends using chirps, whistles, barks and other sounds that echo through the water. I'm a marine mammal, but I'm more closely related to elephants than I am to whales or dolphins. I am found in tropical and subtropical waters in more than 40 countries, spanning all the way from East Africa to Vanuatu in the Pacific.
Wow, they're broad range, aren't they?
Absolutely. So you're right, I am a dugong, also known as a sea cow. Dugongs are one of 4 living species in the order Sirenia, which also includes 3 species of manatees. The name Sirenia derives from the Greek mythological sirens, who were enchanting sea nymphs who lured sailors to their peril with songs. I don't know about you, Brett, but I think those sailors must have been hitting the rum barrels a bit too hard.
I reckon they might have. Yeah, no more rum for them.
Well, I guess it gets lonely out at sea.
Yeah,
so.
could do. Yeah, you'll see anything.
They definitely don't look like Princess Ariel, but they are incredibly adorable and charismatic creatures. Here in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, they typically don't hang around the outer coral reef. Rather, they live close to shore where the shallow seagrass beds are found. And that's also where the crocodiles live, so most people don't go snorkeling or diving with them. So sadly, I've never personally snorkeled or dived with a dugong. Have you, Brett?
Oh, geez, I wish I could say yes. Of all the stuff I've seen underwater, I have not seen one.
You spent decades in the water. You spent many, many hours. So that goes to show how elusive they are, at least in the areas where people usually go diving and snorkeling.
The only one I have seen is the one at Sydney Aquarium.
Oh.
Yeah, but he's got the Dugong Cafe that serves just lettuce.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
So, according to my friends who work at Green Island, just off Cairns, there is a dugong who is often sighted there. And I mean, by often, that's probably like once or twice a year or something.
That's often.
Whom they have named Dylan. And Dylan the dugong. And that makes sense because there are plentiful seagrass meadows at Green Island, so it seems like a nice place for a dugong to hang out. But what do we know about dugong populations across the world? What threats are they facing and what can we do to help protect them? Joining us to help unpack these questions, we're incredibly honoured to have a guest today who is a James Cook University dugong expert, Emeritus Professor of Environmental Science, Helene Marsh. Good morning, Professor Marsh. Welcome to Word on the Reef.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good morning, Professor. Thanks for joining us. So we're really looking forward to this one.
It's great to have you on the show. I understand your scientific career started way back in the 60s and you've had an incredible, inspiring career researching and advocating for marine life. Your CV must be about 1,000 pages long. Can you sum it up for us and also explain how you first fell in love with dugongs?
Okay, well, I've been very lucky and I've had the opportunity to work on a number of marine animals. In fact, I didn't start out working on dugongs at all. I started out studying cone shell venom, which is really, really different. But after I finished my PhD, and it was in the early 70s, I was unexpectedly given an opportunity to help with some research on dugongs, and my involvement went from there.
Amazing. You've had over 200 writings published. You've worked at the British Museum. You've worked for CSIRO. You've done many, many different things over your career. But one thing that I saw pop out was that you were a new idea in 1983. Can you tell us about that?
Oh, that was pretty embarrassing, actually. I didn't know anything about it. And suddenly I see a photo of me on the cover of New Idea, and they were interested in...
On the cover? Wow.
On marine scientists and women doing scientific research, and suddenly there was me, and I have to tell you that some of my scientist friends thought this was a bit of a joke.
Oh, that's a bit rough.
Oh, they're just jealous because they've never been on the
front cover.
That's amazing. Way back in 83, they're all about women in STEM. Love to see it.
So it was a really, really long time ago. Anyway, that was, yes, I was a bit embarrassed about it because, you know, I literally didn't know that it was going to happen.
Well, you're very humble. Professor Marsh, can you please tell us about some of your best ever personal interactions with dugongs? Have you ever swum with them?
Yes, but when you swim with a dugong, it's very much on the dugong's terms, and that's probably why people find it really hard. The first live dugong, I met some dead ones, but the first live dugong that I met was in an aquarium in Cairns, and there was a calf there for a few months. It eventually died, and I had the opportunity to try and feed that calf with a bottle.
Oh, wow.
It was a bit like cuddling sandpaper, I want to say.
Yeah.
They have quite a rough skin, but it was so exciting, and I certainly fell in love with that calf.
Where was that aquarium back then? Was that the one at the Pier Marketplace, the smaller one?
It was very small. Yes, that's probably what
I think that was the only one that we had back then at the pier.
It was pretty basic.
Yeah. So the skin, you say, is rough. Would you... I don't know whether you've done any time with sharks. So it's a similar skin to sharks?
No, it's nothing like sharks.
Yeah. But
they have very, very fine hairs all over their body. I mean, people see the whiskers on the muzzle and, you know, those bristles on the muzzle. Everyone's familiar with those. But there are really fine hairs all over the whole body, quite sparse, and they're like cat's whiskers. And they're sensory hairs. So dugongs actually learn a lot from feeling, and it's those hairs that make it feel a bit rough.
Well, they also have a common ancestor with elephants. So
yeah, that's blown me away.
I imagine the feeling of leathery elephant skin more so than shark skin, which is scaly teeth. If
they're just eating seagrass, what are they primarily using those whiskers for? Is it just so they don't bump into stuff like a cat? Okay,
now it depends on which bit. So the ones on the muzzle, they are using to find seagrass, but the ones on their body, some people think it's a bit like a lateral line in a fish.
Yep, I gotcha.
They're getting all sorts of information from that. And when people have studied the brains of their cousins, the manatees, they find a huge part of the brain which is about getting information from feeling. So that's probably that whole sense of feeling and touch is really, really important for them.
Yeah, wow.
Anyone who's been on social media might know about a famous baby hippo, Mu Deng. Have you seen him? Him or her, sorry. Can't remember if it's male or female. It's famous, went viral on the internet for being the most adorable little roly-poly.
Yeah, he was pretty cute.
Baby hippo. But when I saw a picture of some scientists holding a baby dugong for research purposes, please listeners, don't go picking up baby dugongs.
Let's not do that.
But no. I saw some researchers holding a baby dugong so they could, release it into the wild or whatever, and it was so adorable.
Yeah, I know. They don't look real, do they?
It was just like a little potato, like a big potato.
With whiskers.
Yeah. Super cute.
Absolutely. But besides being completely adorable, why is it important to protect dugongs? What's important about them?
Well, I think there's two sorts of importance, or maybe three. The first one is they're culturally very significant to people, particularly Indigenous people, throughout their range. And in some places, that cultural link goes back many thousands of years. The second one is that they're ecosystem engineers, and they help maintain healthy seagrass beds. in areas where they occur and dig up seagrass.
They're good gardeners, aren't they?
They're very good gardeners.
Which creates regrowth, which provides that for the other animals, so they're right at the top.
And I think the third reason, which you might think is a bit of a geeky reason, is that they're a really important part of, if you like, the tree of life. They're the only member of a family called the dugongidae, and they're only one of 4 members of the order Sirenia or sea cow. So if you lose the dugong, it's a bit like chopping off a limb from a tree, the tree of life.
It would be like losing our elephants.
Yeah, that's not even worth thinking about.
Professor Marsh, I understand you work with Dr. Christoph Klager, who leads the fieldwork on dugongs, and we know it is his mission to find the dugongs and figure out how many there are and where they live, which is probably easier said than done because you can't just knock on their door and ask them to fill out a census form. So, Professor Marsh, can you sort of explain how he and the other researchers do it? How do they go and find out how many dugongs there are and how do they find them?
Okay, well, the basic technique actually I invented and developed a long time ago in the 1980s, which was to use aerial surveys at a very large spatial scale, and we used human observers and we did some fancy mathematics, which got increasingly fancy, to calculate the dugongs that people couldn't see because of in turbid water. What Chris has done is he's continued some of those manned surveys. They're very nerve-wracking to do. I've decided I've done enough. But now Chris is developing techniques using cameras and AI, which will improve the technique and be a lot less risky for people, because we've flown, small, light aircraft, sometimes quite a way out off land, depending on where, in areas where there's a lot of shallow water, particularly, say, the northern Great Barrier Reef and Torres Strait. And we've been very lucky. We haven't had aircraft accidents, but you wonder how many lives you've got doing that.
Oh, so you got some thrills hanging out of helicopters looking for dugongs?
No, mainly we've used
aeroplanes, okay.
Fixed-wing aircraft. People have used helicopters in some parts of the world, but they're very expensive and they don't have the same endurance as fixed-wing aircraft. But yes, it is, it's dangerous work because you're flying low over water. So I think what Chris is doing is really important because the detectability will be better. I think they've got AI now that's trained, that's at least as good and perhaps a bit better than human observers, and also it's much safer.
I actually watched that YouTube video that you passed on. He's using drones now, right? Launching them off the ship.
Yeah, well, I think it's amazing, Professor Marsh, that you put your life potentially on the line for the dugongs, zooming around.
Yeah, I'm sure they appreciate it.
Trying to count them. AI, it's not quite there yet, I think, because online someone said that they posted a picture of their seal that they were rehabilitating and Instagram blocked it and said we've detected a naked person.
Imagine what they're going to say when they see a photo of a dugong. What's old chat GPT going to come up with?
Mermaids are real.
Mermaids need a shave.
No, I think there's...
Okay, there's two sorts of surveys using drones. There's fairly local surveys using small drones, and lots of people are doing that all over the world. And then there are replicates, I guess, of our very large-scale surveys, which you can't just use a small drone for that. And that will eventually be done by large drones. At the moment, what Chris has been doing is using cameras from fixed-wing aircraft travelling slow and then taking, thousands of photos and then using AI to detect dugongs. And that's been a huge amount of work and perfecting those techniques, and also not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because, of course, we've got all this historical information that was collected using human observers.
a different video that I watched about Dr. Claygere's research in the field saw him and other scientists jumping in the water with dugongs. It must be
and then having them up the side of the boat.
Yeah, it must be a bit of an experience.
Okay. So another thing that we've been doing for a long time and that Chris is continuing is satellite tracking dugongs. Mm-hmm. And that involves catching them and attaching the satellite transmitters to see where they go. And that's been very important because what we found is that some dugongs don't go very far and come in and out with the tide, and other dugongs, and we don't really understand this, can make quite long trips, both there and back.
The adventurous ones.
Yeah, and, why are they doing it?
Would that be... Well, what are the mating habits of these things? Are they moving out to try and find a mate? Is that why they're moving long distances?
Well, we're not sure about that because both males and females do it, including females with calves. I think that part of it is because seagrass beds can get quite damaged by extreme weather events, and the animals have to move to greener pastures and find somewhere else to eat. Yep. And I think that animals have these mental maps of where they can find alternative sources of food, and maybe they go and check them out occasionally. Mm-hmm. But really, we don't know why they do that. We certainly know that dugongs need to eat a lot, and if their seagrass beds are damaged, they either have to move, or some of them stay around and starve and die, which is not a great strategy, but most of them move.
It was incredible seeing the video of the researchers handling the dugong so they can satellite tag it, because you've got to remember these animals can weigh more than half a tonne.
Have you ever done any of that, like they pull them up to the side of the boat and tag them and do all the stuff they need to them? Does rolling them on the back work the same as sharks?
I've done a bit of it, but I want to say that I've never caught a dugong using a rodeo technique. I think you need to be a bit bigger and stronger than I am. So
you're suggesting that that's what Chris does? He uses a lasso?
Yeah.
Rodeo manatees.
Oh, rodeo as in having to jump on its back.
Yeah, people do that, but they also use nets to catch manatees, but nets haven't really been used to catch dugongs. It's been seen to be too dangerous, but the technique that's been developed was adapted actually from the rodeo technique developed to catch turtles.
Oh, wow. Okay, so don't try this at home, folks. This is only for researchers, because it's...
No jumping on animals, please.
If it's done inexpertly, I'm sure it's just unnecessary stress to the animal. But in your case, you guys are getting valuable data about how to protect them. So did you find out around about how many dugongs are there in Australia and on the Great Barrier Reef?
Okay, the overall estimate for Australia, if you add up all the aerial survey estimates, comes to about 165,000, which makes Australia by far the dugong capital of the world. In the Great Barrier Reef, there's probably about 10,000, 9 or 10, and the numbers in the northern Great Barrier Reef, north of Cooktown, are much greater than further south, but there's a lot more seagrass as well.
So down the Brisbane end of the coast, there's less dugongs, and there's more in the north.
Would that be up in the Gulf?
And there are quite a lot in the Gulf.
Yeah.
And there are quite a lot, actually, in southeast Queensland, in Moreton Bay and Hervey Bay. And Moreton Bay is a very good place for dugongs, and it's a special place because there are animals close to a major city in fairly clear water.
Wow, amazing. So how healthy are the dugongs that you're commonly coming across in our waters?
Usually they're in pretty good condition unless the seagrass has been damaged by extreme weather events. But Chris and I and others have a student who's looking at whether you can look at how healthy a dugong is, how fat it is, from drone photography. And there are other people that are working on that too in other parts of the world. But it will be very good if people can make essentially a remote health assessment. The other thing that we think about when we think about how healthy dugongs are is their genetic health. And in Australia, I want to say that the dugongs are genetically pretty healthy, but there are some other parts of the world where the genetic diversity is a lot less.
Professor Marsh, last year you oversaw a major global assessment of dugong status and conservation needs. That's the global dugong population. Can you tell us briefly about that report and what its key findings were?
Well, that report was the work of a team of 70 scientists from throughout the dugongs range, and it was my job to lead the group. But I want to emphasise the very important contributions that we got from everyone else. It was the sort of thing that you couldn't do on your own. So what did we learn? We learned that Australia is the lucky country when it comes to dugongs. We have a lot of dugong habitat because we have a very wide continental shelf in the north, so we have a lot of shallow water. And, of course, the other thing is, we're a rich country and we have a relatively low human population density in most of the dugongs range. The challenges are very different from many other countries. There are more than 40 of them. We're not exactly sure how many because there are some places where we think there should be dugongs where there's no data. And the populations there everywhere else are much smaller, and the challenges for conservation are much greater because people are poor and the countries don't have the same amount of money to invest in conservation. So, for example, in the Great Barrier Reef, from the middle of next year, there will be no gill nets, and which is a sort of net that's quite dangerous
thank God.
for dugongs.
Yeah.
But eliminating gill nets in many other countries will be super hard because we have fishermen who are very poor and need the income to feed their families.
Yeah, I think that's why foreign aid from the developed countries to the developing countries is really important, because it's not just helping humans, which is extremely important, but then if humans have better social security safety nets, then they're less reliant on these unsustainable practices.
And just having a look at the different IUCN Red List status around the world, that big report, that was incredible to see the mass differences in that.
It is, isn't it? And to realise what a huge challenge. And, since that report was written, we talked about the fact that there were a number of countries which were at war. And, of course, the number of countries affected by war in the dugongs range has just gone up with the situation in the Arabian Gulf.
Yeah, well, I definitely wanted to ask you about that. I've read that dugongs can be found in huge herds, especially in the southern Arabian Gulf. That's right next to the Strait of Hormuz, which has been in the news a lot lately.
Yeah, look out, dugongs.
I have to ask, are they at risk from Donald Trump's war with Iran?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think there are two big issues. The first one is if there are oil spills. So far there haven't been that I know of, but if we start getting, oil tankers hit and there are oil spills, that would be disastrous for marine life in the Gulf.
Yeah,
the second one is that really understanding the situation in the Gulf requires a lot of regional cooperation between all the various countries, and they've got better things to think about at the moment, as you know, more challenging things. And I'll give you an example. There was supposed to be an international conference on seagrasses in the UAE at the end of this year, and it's being postponed because of the war. So those Arabian Gulf countries are rich countries, and they're very proud of their dugongs, particularly the UAE. But you can see that challenges of field work, etc., are very great at the moment. And one of the things I learned from the report was that there was very little had been done in Iran, and we needed to know a lot more, and of course that won't be happening now.
Right. So to sum up the major global assessment of dugong status, from what I saw from it, the dugong population is vulnerable in general to extinction, but in some key areas it's at a higher level of endangered, depending on the area. So let's dive into a bit more the threats of dugongs. So you mentioned that the biggest threat to dugongs is entanglement in fishing nets. Just for any listeners who aren't familiar, what is a gill net and why do dugongs always get stuck in them?
Okay, well, I want to say, by the way, that now there are very few gill nets left in the Great Barrier Reef and none north of Cooktown. And as I said, the Australian government has made a commitment that there won't be any more up to the middle of next year. So a gill net is a net in the water which is designed to catch fish by the gills. But it can catch megafauna as well, and it's a very simple sort of net and cheap, and that's why FAO subsidised them to be used in developing countries all over the world from the 1960s, with the best of intentions, of course, because this was trying to feed people. But as I said, they have this unintended consequence. And in Queensland, a lot of attention came from the shark nets set for bather protection, which are a type of gill net, and they're a bit different from commercial gill nets because they were in the water all the time in most parts. You know, there were 62 different beaches in Queensland with those nets, and they were obviously designed to reduce the population of sharks, which they did. But the shark nets kept very good records. So we were able to analyse those records and show a drastic decline in the catch per unit effort of dugongs over time. And I'm very pleased to say now that actually shark nets have been removed from Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. There aren't any. There are a couple in the region near Mackay, but not in the marine park. But of course they've been replaced by drum lines, which still catch sharks, and they don't catch dugongs, but there is other bycatch of concern. I think actually doing something about sharks is a very tough problem, because obviously no one wants to be eaten by a shark. But I want to say, when I think about sharks and what to do about it, I'm glad I'm a scientist, not a policy maker.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Let's talk about some history. I understand back in the 90s there was a conflict here in Queensland known as the Dugong Wars. Now, if any listeners...
Oh, yeah, I heard about that.
If any listeners are imagining dugongs carrying out underwater spy operations and launching torpedoes at each other... Missile launches,
and yeah, they're crazy little buggers.
That's actually not what I'm talking about, though. Professor Marsh, what were the Dugong Wars?
Oh, well, the conservation NGOs in particular were deeply concerned about dugongs being caught in gill nets. As a scientist, I was too. But the fishermen didn't want the number of licences reduced, and they didn't want areas being closed. And the war was really about that.
A war of words.
It was a war of words, a war of, newspaper headlines and articles. And things did get pretty nasty, actually. At one point, I'd been out in the field doing an aerial survey, and I came back, and I remember it was a Sunday, and I opened up my email, and there was an email from the Director General of the International Union of Conservation of Nature saying that there had been a formal complaint about me, and it turned out to be somebody who was connected with the fishing industry, actually paid by them, alleging that I'd made all this stuff up. And, and I got a few, and there was also a website, and, there was no social media then, but saying terrible things about me. And in the end, I got a lawyer to send a letter saying, please desist, because, we weren't going to have the money to take it to court or anything. But and they did desist. But it was a hard time to be a dugong researcher, and there were fishermen who weren't very happy at all.
I can imagine it would have been difficult. I think for scientists, it takes a lot of bravery to speak out about things sometimes. For example, nowadays on climate change as well, when you know that there are many interests who might not like certain science being talked about. So I think it was brave that you stood up for dugongs despite, some of that backlash. And in the end, it was the right thing to do, and it succeeded because it led to the introduction of, I believe, dugong protected areas. What are those and how does that work?
Okay, dugong protected areas were introduced under fishing legislation to either reduce or ban the use of gill nets in areas which were important to dugongs. Then in 2003, we had the rezoning of the Great Barrier Reef with lots of green zones where commercial fishing and recreational fishing was banned, and in yellow zones where commercial fishing was banned. And so there has been amazing improvements, I think, in protecting dugongs and other megafauna from commercial fishing, but there is still concern over some highly protected species, which is why the Australian government made a commitment to the
UNESCO
World Heritage Centre to remove them.
Yeah, absolutely. There was pressure from the World Heritage Committee because there were still some gill nets. I think all your work going back to the 90s really helped, yes, Professor Marsh, and it got rid of a lot of the gill nets, but there were still some left, including in the Cairns and Port Douglas regions, which are so dependent on tourism. And so to know that sharks and things that tourists come from all over the world to see were still, or could be right now, still be getting accidentally caught in those nets is a bit sad. 2027 is the deadline that has been set for those to be closed down, and that's going to be a step forward for those dugongs.
Well, we've got the humpback superhighway in winter too. Turtles, baby humpbacks, minkies, everything. It's just, they just need to go. Just get rid of them all.
Yeah, well, I don't think a whale could get caught in a gill net exactly because it's probably too big.
They get entangled in them though.
Do they? Okay.
They can get entangled. Yeah. And of course, whales do get caught in shark nets in south of Queensland. I mean, I want to say these problems are very tough for policymakers, very tough. But they are easier in Australia than they are in, say, India. I mean, the area between the south of India and Sri Lanka was an important dugong area, much smaller than areas in Australia. And there I found in the report that there were something like, 900 gill netters and another 1,300 vessels whose fishing gear could damage seagrass. And these are very, very poor people. And so it's a totally different problem.
Yeah. Well, another thing that has helped a lot in some fishing-dependent countries is transitioning some of the fisher people to tourism so they can have an income from showing people the beautiful ocean instead of fishing it. So there are solutions out there, but like you say, it is a very tricky issue and people need to be involved in it as well as animals.
Is there any dedicated dugong watching boats? Like, would that be something to help with education, like getting people out on boats? And
I'd be on it.
I'd be there. Yeah.
It depends on where. There are some in Shark Bay, in the World Heritage Area in Western Australia, where the water's pretty clear. In parts of the Red Sea in Egypt, where the water's very clear, they take people out to see dugongs, but then you see hundreds of people, snorkelers and divers, kind of chasing dugongs, which isn't great.
No, don't chase them, folks. If you see one, just be chilled.
Not every dugong habitat's going to turn into a tourist attraction, particularly very turbid places. But one of the places that is amazing is a bay in Mozambique, which is a bit like Moreton Bay without Brisbane, if you could imagine it. And there, the dugong population is managed by African parks, and they have an arrangement with the Mozambique government that significant proportion of the tourism income has to go back to the local communities, and that has been very successful.
Wow, that is a perfect example of what I was trying to say about getting the people into ecotourism instead of fishing where possible is an amazing win-win solution. This is where we ran out of time for our live radio interview, but I called Professor Marsh back a few days later to continue the conversation. I'm going to sum up a few things before going back into the rest of the interview. Professor Marsh explained that extreme weather events can be devastating to the seagrass beds that dugongs rely on for food. Dugongs need to eat up to 30 kilograms of seagrass per day, so any event which wipes out huge areas of seagrass is probably going to have an impact. That's why it's so concerning that climate change has been causing more frequent severe cyclones over recent decades. The impacts vary depending on the tide height, but cyclones can tear up vast areas of seagrass by the roots and wash all the seeds away, making recovery extremely difficult, as seen during Cyclone Yasi in 2011, which was disastrous for vast areas of seagrass. Climate change is also making floods more frequent and severe, with floodwaters carrying sediment, fertilisers and pesticides from land more than 100 kilometres out to sea. A normal amount of flooding can bring beneficial nutrients to seagrass, but if the sediment dumped by a flood into the ocean is metres deep, seagrass can't break through. And if the flooding is happening repeatedly for several years in a row, it's even harder for the seagrass to recover. If an extreme weather event only impacts a small area of seagrass, dugongs can simply migrate to greener pastures. But with severe weather events becoming more frequent and widespread, those pastures are becoming fewer and further between. Perhaps partly because of these factors, dugong numbers have declined significantly on the southern Great Barrier Reef in the past 20 years, with populations dropping by an estimated 2.3% annually since 2005 between Mission Beach and Bundaberg.
And then, of course, there's sea level rise, and there are some places in the world where probably the seagrass beds will move inshore, but there are some places where the coastline is very developed and that can't happen.
What can be done to help protect dugongs from seagrass loss?
I think that doing something about climate change is obviously the most important thing. I also think that in these places where dugongs are impacted, then we have to do things about the things we can control. And so, for example, the federal government promised the World Heritage Committee that gill nets would be removed from the Great Barrier Reef, not just because of the impact on dugongs, but the impact on a whole series of threatened species, and also not forgetting the overall impact of climate change, and the only way we're going to quell that in the long term is move through the energy transition and reduce the amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere.
And that's a good reinforcement to everyone at home that we can all do things in our own life to reduce our carbon footprints, but also, speak to our leaders and decision makers and let them know that dugongs need a reduction in emissions. And
yes.
not just dugongs, of course, but everyone.
Yeah, indeed.
Traditional owners have been hunting dugongs for subsistence in Australia for thousands of years, and historically they had their own fisheries management strategies in place to ensure the practice remained sustainable, as they wanted to pass it on to each ensuing generation. European settlers disrupted those management practices and established a commercial dugong fishery which had a big impact on their population.
When Europeans settled in Australia, there were dugong oil industries which were set up by Europeans at many places along the Queensland coast. It looks like the populations have gradually been able to recover from that.
I just have to stop you because dugong oil, what were they collecting that for?
Oh, as a medicine.
Medicine.
So you could buy dugong oil in some chemist shops in Brisbane as late as the 1960s, I think.
Right.
I think it was finally banned in 1967.
Wow. Right next to the snake oil, I suppose. And what was it prescribed for?
Oh, well, general health. I mean, people used to take cod liver oil. I don't know if you ever heard about that.
Well, you can still get cod liver oil from the chemist, I believe.
Okay, and so dugong oil was often used as a substitute for cod liver oil, and some Indigenous people still believe that dugong oil is very important medicine and good to rub on the skin and etc. But in Moreton Bay near Brisbane there was quite a sort of cottage industry for dugong oil, and it was even shown at the London exhibition in the middle of the 18th century as this extraordinary cure oil. And I have a quote which I think was 1870 by a guy called Petitions, and he said something like this: of all the resources of the great state of Queensland, none is more valuable than the flocks of dugong that abound along her shores. And there was a dugong oil industry in Hervey Bay. There were a few other places along the Great Barrier Reef and also the Starkey River north of Hopevale. And so it was a cottage industry. It wasn't a great big industry, but it certainly would have had an impact.
Does traditional hunting pose a significant threat to dugong populations, or would you say it's more the European introduced threats, like we've talked about the gill nets and climate change from modern industrialisation?
Oh, I think that it's much more the latter. I think people used to be very worried about Indigenous hunting, but Indigenous hunting is a native title right, and traditional owners, as you said, want to keep it sustainable. They want there to be dugongs for their children, and they are very, very important in caring for the country and looking after it.
What role do traditional owners play in protecting dugongs?
Very important roles. So dugongs are of incredibly high cultural value to First Nations people throughout their range, and particularly in Australia. And I think some First Nations people have developed hunting management plans and things like that. And I've found that First Nations people are deeply concerned about the other impacts on their dugongs and are very anxious to see the other impacts addressed. So I think that actually working with First Nations people to understand how they can assist, and also how their Indigenous knowledge can work together with Western science to come up with robust management strategies. And I think we're getting a bit better at that. And, you know, I'm very encouraged to see how First Nations people are getting increasingly involved across the north in caring for their country. And I think that the ranger programs are really, really, really important and are getting more sophisticated, yes. So I definitely think working with them is central to a resilient dugong conservation strategy.
What would you say is the best part of your job?
Oh, well, the best part of my job when I was doing lots of field work was going to absolutely amazing and beautiful places and seeing dugongs from the air. That was just amazing. And then, of course, I've been very privileged to have travelled and talked to traditional owners and dugong researchers in many, many places in their range. So I've been to fantastic places, and that's what I like the most.
Amazing. Well, everyone's jealous. Hopefully you inspired some more people out there to become scientists.
I hope so.
What is the saddest or hardest part of your job?
Oh, the hardest part of my job was when I first started studying dugongs, most of the animals I saw were dead. because Townsville's a very, very good dugong place because there's a lot of seagrass in Townsville. So Townsville's one of the most important dugong places on the urban coast of the Great Barrier Reef region. There are more important places on the Cape York coast, but Townsville's very good. And there were shark nets for bather protection and gill nets, and so I used to go out and have to do necropsies on dead animals, and that was very sad indeed. Awful.
Wow. Well, I can only imagine how glad you must be after all these years to know that the gill nets are being phased out next year.
And also the shark nets have been removed from virtually the whole Great Barrier Reef World Heritage Area. I think there are only 2 left around Mackay in not particularly important dugong areas. So that's been a big change, an amazing change. But of course, there are still drum lines that catch sharks, and I hope we can move to much more sophisticated ways of reducing the risk of shark attack. I think I said this to you before. When I think about the whole question of managing the risk to people from shark attack, I'm glad I'm just a scientist and not a policy maker. A pretty tough challenge.
Yeah, well, there has been some research on drumlines that they may not be effective at protecting humans anyway, so...
But they certainly catch a lot of sharks, and many of the sharks that they catch are not a danger to humans at all. So it's a very tough question and very complicated, and I don't see a quick answer in Queensland, but they are looking at trying to find answers. So good luck.
Last question, what gives you hope?
Well, I guess people are very creative, and I hope that we can address some of these issues. The problem is, of course, that we're much better at solving things that have short-term solutions than things with long-term solutions, and I'm afraid that some of the challenges we face with regard to climate change are going to require sustained and long-term solutions, which is politically very difficult.
What can the listeners out there do to help protect dugongs, even if it's making changes in their own life to lessen their impact on the ocean?
Well, I think the whole question of plastic on the ocean is something that people can really think about, and the disposal of plastic. There hasn't been a lot of work done on plastic and dugongs. We do know that a calf became very famous in Thailand, died from plastic, but in general I don't think we know. But there are so many marine megafauna where plastic is concerned, particularly turtles. I think we all should be reducing our use of plastic and also making sure it doesn't go into the sea.
Yep.
Excellent advice. Yep. Sadly, that's all we have time for today. James Cook University dugong expert, Emeritus Professor of Environmental Science, Helene Marsh, thanks for all your amazing work, and thanks for joining us on Word on the Reef.
It's a pleasure.
Have a great week.